It started with silence. Not the kind that comforts, but the kind that swallows everything. Somewhere deep beneath the North Atlantic, a German U-boat drifted in darkness. Its engines were dead. Its air was thick. Its crew, 47 men, sat in absolute stillness, listening to the sound of pressure and death pressing on their steel walls. The clock read 1:42. The diesel engines had failed nearly 4 hours earlier. One moment, the rhythmic rumble filled the narrow hull. The next, a violent shudder, a flicker of lights, and then nothing. For the men aboard U-407, this was supposed to be a routine patrol. Their mission? Intercept Allied supply convoys heading toward Britain. Their commander, Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Krüger, was known for precision, calm under fire, respected, methodical. But now, even he couldn't study the creeping fear in his men's eyes. They were stranded, 180 meters below the surface. No propulsion, no light, no communication. And worst of all, the battery systems were draining fast. "Keep calm," Krüger ordered, his voice echoing through the narrow corridor. "We'll find the fault." But even he knew, if they didn't fix it soon, carbon dioxide would rise, oxygen would vanish, and they'd suffocate before the ocean crushed them. The mechanic, Otto Weber, worked feverishly with oil-stained hands, cursing in whispers. The backup generator had blown a fuse when seawater leaked into the aft compartment. Every repair attempt risked a spark, and a spark could mean death. Diesel fumes hung heavy. Above them, the Atlantic roared, a storm tossing waves like angry fists. Allied destroyers were rumored to be hunting nearby, pinging sonar, dropping depth charges. The crew didn't dare surface. Krüger faced an impossible choice: surface and risk detection, or stay submerged and slowly die in the dark. The men whispered prayers in the bunks. Some stared at pictures of wives and children. Others scribbled notes in trembling handwriting, unsure if anyone would ever read them. By morning, the temperature had dropped sharply. Condensation dripped from metal ceilings like rain. The men's breath misted in the cold air. "We need to restart the engine manually," Weber said, finally. His voice cracked, part exhaustion, part fear. Krüger nodded. "Then we do it." It was madness. Restarting a diesel engine underwater was suicide. But Krüger had always said, a slow death is worse than a fast one. Two men crawled into the engine room, flashlights flickering weakly. The smell of fuel was overwhelming. The electric batteries were almost depleted. Only the faint hum of emergency lights kept the shadows from swallowing the hull entirely. "We can bleed the lines manually," Weber muttered. "If it doesn't ignite immediately, we—" A loud clang echoed through the corridor. Everyone froze. It came from the forward torpedo room, a wrench slipping, or something else. Then silence again, the kind that hurts your ears. Day one turned into night one. The air gauge showed oxygen dropping below safe levels. Men began coughing, their throats raw from fumes and fear. The youngest sailor, barely 18, collapsed while trying to breathe through a rag soaked in alcohol, a desperate trick they learned to ease carbon buildup. Krüger gathered the crew in the central compartment. "Listen," he said, his voice rough but steady. "We'll make it through, but we follow order. No shouting, no panic. Every breath counts." He pointed to a small chalkboard. On it he wrote in shaky letters, "Oxygen rotation, 5 minutes each compartment." Every 5 minutes, one compartment's vents would open to share what little fresh air remained. "Ration the air," Weber whispered. "Imagine that." They laughed, but it wasn't real laughter. It was the kind you use to keep from breaking. By the second day, hallucinations began. The confined heat, sweat, and lack of oxygen twisted minds. One sailor claimed he heard waves crashing above, though they were still hundreds of meters deep. Another swore he saw daylight leaking through the hull seams. Krüger ignored it. He had to. But deep down, he was haunted too. Not by the sea, but by memory. Just 2 years earlier,
He'd been on another U-boat, U-96, during a failed convoy attack. His friend, the second officer, had suffocated after a depth charge ruptured the air tanks. The sound of his gasping still echoed in his nightmares. Now fate had brought him here again. Another steel coffin, another crew counting breaths. "Sir," came a whisper. "The batteries, they're almost gone." "How long?" 2 hours, maybe less." He closed his eyes. "Then we prepare to surface." The crew froze. Surface? In enemy-controlled waters? The radar above would catch them in seconds. A destroyer could blow them apart before they even cleared the waves. But the alternative, death by suffocation, was worse. "Ballast control ready," shouted Weber. The hull groaned as compressed air pushed water from the tanks. Meters climbed. 160, 140, 120. Suddenly, boom! A depth charge detonated nearby. The shockwave slammed the boat sideways. Pipes burst. One man was thrown against the wall, blood trickling from his nose. Lights flickered out completely. "They found us!" someone yelled. Kruger roared back. "Silence! Shut down all movement! Stay dead!" The submarine dropped again, sliding back into the black. Depth gauge spun downward. 200, 220, 240 meters. The hull creaked dangerously. The destroyer above passed, but not before dropping another charge. The thunder rolled through metal, shaking bolts loose. But miraculously, U-407 held together. When quiet returned, it wasn't relief. It was exhaustion. The crew looked like ghosts, pale and drenched in sweat. The air was nearly unbreathable. Hours later, a faint vibration. The generator sputtered as Odo Weber's hands trembled as he turned the crank again. "Come on, come on." For a moment, there was nothing. Then a low rumble. The engine coughed to life. The crew erupted in cheers that quickly turned into tears. After 36 hours of hell, they had power again. Dim lights flickered to life. Pumps whirred, air systems restarted with a hiss. But Kruger knew the fight wasn't over. They were still deep, still hunted, still vulnerable.
He stared at the navigation chart. They'd drifted far from patrol coordinates, maybe near Iceland. Surfacing now meant revealing themselves, yet staying down too long could mean another breakdown. "Plot a course due west," he ordered. "We'll risk the storm. If we die on the surface, not like rats." The men nodded. For the first time in 2 days, they believed again. As the submarine slowly rose, the pressure eased. They could hear waves crashing above. The sound, after so long in silence, was almost beautiful. When the periscope broke the surface, the ocean stretched endless in black. Lightning flashed across the horizon, painting the sea silver. The wind screamed, nature's reminder that war wasn't the only enemy out here. Kruger whispered, "Surface the boat." The hatch opened, and freezing air rushed in. Men gasped, coughing, laughing, and weeping all at once. The stars looked brighter than they'd ever remembered. But their celebration didn't last long. On the horizon, faint lights appeared. A convoy, allied, armed, and heading straight for them. Kruger's eyes widened. "Down! Dive again!" But as the engines roared to pull them under, another jolt hit. The same system that had just saved them now betrayed them again. This time, there might not be a second chance. The sea outside was a living, breathing monster. The sound of depth charges echoed through the iron walls, shaking the submarine like a tin can. Every man inside knew one direct hit would turn the U-boat into a crushed tomb,
under thousands of tons of water. Captain Oberleutnant Karl Voss gripped the periscope handles even though the power was gone. The lights had flickered out 2 hours ago, leaving only the faint red glow of emergency lamps. Sweat ran down his forehead and disappeared into his collar. The men watched him in silence, breathing shallowly to conserve oxygen. "Depth?" he asked. 200 meters, and sinking slowly," came the reply from the helmsman, his voice trembling. "Keep it steady. Don't let her drop below 250, Karl said. But both men knew the ballast tanks were malfunctioning. Water was slowly seeping in through the aft compartment after a near-miss hit jammed the trim pumps. The smell of diesel, oil, and sweat mixed thickly in the narrow corridor. The men hadn't eaten in almost a day. Rations were limited to a few bites of hard bread and a sip of water. The heat inside the submarine was unbearable. Condensation dripped from the ceiling like rain. They were 72 hours into what felt like an eternity. The last radio transmission they had received was garbled, but one word cut through: destroyers. 3 British destroyers were scouring the area, dropping depth charges in patterns. They weren't going anywhere. Inside the control room, Second Officer Hans Weber stared at the depth gauge. "Captain, oxygen levels are dropping fast. We've got maybe 12 hours left." Karl didn't look at him. He just nodded slowly. "Tell the men to stay calm. No one moves unless necessary."
The engine room was a nightmare. 2 mechanics, Schultz and Dieter, worked by flashlight, their faces blackened with grime. They were trying to fix the main battery, the heart of the submarine's electrical system. Without it, there was no power, no propulsion, no air circulation. The U-boat was a metal coffin adrift in the deep. "Battery cell 4 is fried," Schultz muttered, tapping a wrench against the corroded connector. Sparks flew, but nothing came alive. "We're dead down here." Dieter leaned against the wall, panting. "If we can't get it running soon, we'll suffocate before the enemy even finds us." Schultz didn't answer. He could already taste the thick, metallic tang in the air, a sign of rising carbon dioxide. Every breath was harder than the last. Back in the crew quarters, men sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes wide open in the dim red light. Some prayed quietly, others stared blankly at the bulkhead, listening to the eerie groans of the hull under pressure. Suddenly, boom! A depth charge exploded close by. The U-boat jerked violently, and everyone was thrown against the walls. One of the lights burst, plunging the compartment into darkness. "Damage report!" the captain yelled. "Leak in the aft section worsening. Compartment flooding. Seal it off!" Men scrambled through the narrow passageways, slamming bulkhead doors shut. The sound of metal grinding on metal filled the air. Someone screamed. A sailor had been caught on the wrong side of a closing door. His hand was trapped, blood pouring from his fingers as another man pried it free. "Medic!" someone shouted, but there was little anyone could do. The U-boat creaked like an old ship in a storm. The hull flexed under pressure, as though the sea were trying to crush it into submission. Karl climbed a ladder to the radio room. "Any contact with base?" "Negative, sir. Antenna's damaged. No transmission possible." He slammed his fist on the console, breathing hard. He had 48 men under his command, all looking to him for salvation, and he had no idea how to get them home. Then, from the darkness, a voice. It was the youngest sailor, barely 18. "Sir, do you think they'll stop searching soon?" Karl turned, his eyes shadowed. "The British? No. Not until their shore were dead." Hours passed. The U-boat drifted silently in the black void of the Atlantic. Occasionally, the distant rumble of destroyer engines echoed through the deep, a haunting reminder that death waited above. In the torpedo room, a faint humming sound began. Hans rushed in, flashlight shaking in his hand. "Captain, I think Schultz got one of the cells working." Karl sprinted to the engine room. There, amidst the smoke and fumes, a faint blue spark flickered to life. "It's alive," Schultz whispered. "Not much, but enough for a few systems." "Good work," Karl said. "Divert power to air circulation and lights." The fan started spinning weakly, pushing the stale air around.
It wasn't much, but it felt like a miracle. Then another explosion rocked the submarine. "God damn it!" Carl shouted. "They're still out there!" Hans wiped sweat from his brow. "Captain, if we surface, they'll destroy us. If we stay down, we'll run out of air." Carl paused, his jaw tight. "Then we surface under the cover of night." "But the engines?" "We use what's left of the battery, just enough to reach the surface and recharge." The crew prepared for the most dangerous maneuver of their lives. If even one destroyer spotted them, it was over. At 0000 hours, Carl gave the order. "Blow ballast tanks." The submarine shuddered as compressed air forced water out of its tanks. Slowly, painfully, the U-boat began to rise. Meters turned into seconds. Every man held his breath. 50 meters. 30. 20. Suddenly, a loud thud shook the hull. "Depth charge! Close proximity!" Hans shouted. The explosion ripped through the rear compartment. The lights went out again. Smoke filled the control room. Men coughed and gagged.
"We're losing pressure," someone yelled. Carl forced his way to the console. "Hold her steady, we can't abort now." The submarine broke the surface with a violent surge. The night air poured in through the hatch, cold, salty, glorious. "Open vents, get fresh air in," Carl ordered. Men gasped and choked as they climbed toward the conning tower. For the first time in 3 days, they saw the stars. But there was no time to celebrate. Hans peered through binoculars. "Destroyer on the horizon, they've spotted us." "Dive! Dive! Dive!" Carl shouted. But it was too late. The destroyer's searchlights pierced the night, sweeping across the waves. Shells began to fall, splashing dangerously close. The U-boat dove again, its final desperate plunge into the deep. The engines coughed and sputtered, running on dying power. The submarine creaked, its hull weakened by days of punishment. Inside, men braced themselves. They had no control, no power, no hope, only the black silence of the ocean. And yet somehow it kept sinking. Depth, 260 meters, 270. "Stop descent." "I can't, sir. Ballast tanks jammed again." The submarine groaned louder and louder, like a giant whale in agony. "Prepare for crush depth," Carl shouted. Every man closed his eyes. Some prayed, others gritted their teeth. And then, silence. The pressure stopped increasing. 280. "Holding steady," Hans whispered. The boat had miraculously landed on an underwater ridge before reaching crush depth. Carl exhaled shakily. We live another hour. But deep down he knew. The clock was ticking. The silence after the chaos was deafening. No more explosions, no more orders shouted over alarms, only the faint creaking of metal and the labored breathing of 48 men trapped under the sea. The U-boat rested on the cold seabed, tilted slightly to port, its hull pressed against rock and sand at nearly 280 meters below the surface. Captain Carl Voss stood still in the dim red glow of the emergency lights. His ears rang, his chest rose and fell as he tried to process what had just happened. They were alive, barely. The submarine had miraculously landed on an underwater ridge before reaching crush depth. Hans approached him slowly, his voice hoarse. "Sir, we're holding steady. No new leaks." Carl nodded, his expression unreadable. "Report casualties." The medic, Lieutenant Ernst, appeared wiping his hands on a blood-stained rag. 1 dead in the aft section, 2 injured but stable. Everyone else shaken, sir. Carl closed his eyes for a moment. "Give the dead his rights when you can. We'll need every man's strength now." He walked toward the control panels. Most gauges were dark, dead. Only a few needles twitched weakly. The battery indicator hovered near 0. The engines were silent. "Power levels?" he asked. Schultz, still covered in grime from the engine room, replied, "Barely enough to keep life support going. We've got maybe 5 hours before everything shuts down again." The crew exchanged fearful glances. 5 hours of breathable air, then nothing. Carl rubbed his temples. "We'll need to ration oxygen manually. Shut down all non-essential systems." "Aye, sir." Men moved slowly, conserving energy, shutting off lights, fans, even the heating. The temperature inside the steel tomb began to drop. The cold from the depths seeped through the walls, wrapping around them like icy fingers. Hours crawled by.
Somewhere in the darkness, someone began humming a tune, a soft German lullaby. It was eerie, almost childlike, echoing faintly through the corridors. Others joined in, not because they wanted to sing, but because it was the only thing that reminded them they were still human. Then a metallic groan reverberated through the hall. Everyone froze. "Relax," Schultz muttered. "It's just pressure settling." But everyone knew every creak could be their last warning before the sea crushed them like paper. Carl sat on a bench near the radio compartment, staring at the cracked transmitter. It had been silent since the attack. He ran his fingers over the dials, as if willing it to work again. "If only we could send a signal," he whispered. Hans crouched beside him. "Even if we could, sir, rescue would take days. By then..." Carl didn't answer. He knew the rest. The men's breathing grew heavier. Oxygen was thinning, replaced by the suffocating taste of carbon dioxide. Each breath felt like drinking hot metal. In the galley, Dieter, one of the mechanics, opened a tin of beans with trembling hands. "Captain said no waste, but we need something," he muttered. He shared the contents with two others, small spoonfuls that barely touched their hunger.
Nearby, another sailor sat, clutching a locket. Inside was a picture of his wife and baby girl. "She'll never know what happened to me," he said quietly. "You'll tell her yourself when we get back," his friend lied, forcing a smile. The lights flickered again. Then, darkness. The fan stopped. Every man froze. Schultz shouted from the engine room, "Battery's dead, we've lost all power." The submarine fell into absolute silence, a silence so deep it hurt their ears. Carl stood up, voice steady but low. Everyone remained calm. Emergency air cylinders, ration them carefully. The medic moved through the shadows, passing small oxygen masks around. But there weren't enough for everyone. Some men took turns breathing from the same mask. Hours passed. It was impossible to tell how many. Watches had stopped. Time itself seemed to dissolve. The temperature dropped close to freezing. Condensation turned to frost on the metal walls. The men huddled together, their breath forming clouds in the darkness. Then came the knock. A faint, rhythmic sound on the hull. Clang, clang, clang. "Sir, did you hear that?" Hans whispered. Carl turned his head. Clang, clang. He frowned. "That's not an echo." The sound repeated, steady, deliberate. "It's from outside," Schultz said, eyes wide. "Could it be another U-boat?" Carl shook his head. "At this depth, impossible. No one else could be down here." Then it stopped. Silence again. But now something else. A deep rumble far above. Carl climbed to the periscope station, though the scope itself was useless without power. He could feel the vibrations in the hull. "Destroyers," he muttered. "They're still here." The British hadn't given up the hunt. The men looked at each other, realizing what that meant. If the enemy began dropping depth charges again, their resting place would become their grave. But there was nothing they could do. Carl sat down, his back against the cold steel wall. We wait. When the destroyers leave, we surface. If we still can. No one spoke for a long time. Then Hans said softly, "Sir, what if they never leave?" Carl looked at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of despair in his eyes. "Then we die like sailors, with honor." A few men nodded, others looked down. Another 6 hours passed in silence. Some of the crew had passed out from exhaustion or lack of air. The medic moved slowly, checking pulses, his face pale. "Captain, oxygen almost gone. Maybe 1 hour left." Carl took a deep breath. "Schultz, any chance the batteries can be revived?" The engineer hesitated. "Maybe if I vent hydrogen from the ved cells, but it's risky, could ignite." "Do it," Carl ordered. Schultz stared at him. "If it sparks, we'll explode." Carl's voice was calm. "If we do nothing, we'll suffocate. I'll take the explosion." The mechanic nodded. He grabbed a wrench and a toolkit, disappearing into the engine compartment. Minutes felt like hours. Then, a spark. A faint hum. Lights flickered weakly to life. Cheers erupted across the control room. "Air circulation back online," Hans shouted. Carl grinned faintly. "You've done it, Schultz." But the victory was short-lived. The pressure gauge began to climb again. "What's happening? Hydrogen buildup, the cell's rupturing. Vent it." Before anyone could react, boom.
The explosion ripped through the aft section, shaking the entire submarine. Flames erupted, oxygen masks flew off walls, and men were thrown to the ground. Carl coughed violently, smoke filling his lungs. Seal the compartment. But it was too late. The explosion had breached a thin section of the hull. Seawater began pouring in. Flooding! Hull breach in battery room! Men scrambled, grabbing pumps, trying to slow the torrent. The sound of rushing water was deafening. Carl barked orders, voice cutting through the chaos. Close the bulkhead, get the wounded out. Schultz stumbled out of the smoke, his face burned. I'm sorry, sir, I tried. Carl grabbed his shoulder. You saved us once, that's enough. The water kept rising. The floor was now knee-deep. Carl looked at his officers. We can't stay here. Prepare for emergency ascent. Hans looked at him like he'd gone mad. Sir, with the damage we took. I know, but it's our only chance. The men obeyed. They moved to their stations, weak but determined. Carl took one last look at the depth gauge. Blow tanks on my command.
Everyone braced. He raised his hand. Now! Air hissed violently as compressed gas filled the ballast tanks. The submarine trembled, groaned, and then began to rise. The crew felt the shift instantly. The walls vibrated. Hope returned, faint but real. 50 meters, 40. The hull screamed under the pressure change. 30 meters. Come on, come on! 20! Then the sound, that terrible metallic crack. A rivet shot across the room like a bullet. The hull began to buckle. Carl shouted, "Hold her together!" 10 meters! Light filtered through the periscope, faint but there. And then they broke the surface. The men gasped as fresh air poured in through the opened hatch. The cold night wind hit their faces like salvation. But the joy was short-lived. Hans looked through binoculars. His face went pale. "Captain! British destroyer less than 2 kilometers away!" Carl exhaled, almost smiling. "Then we make it count." He turned to his men. "Prepare deck gun. Signal, no surrender." Even half dead, the crew obeyed. As the first searchlight beam found them, U-557, battered, crippled, but defiant, turned its gun toward the enemy. The sea erupted in thunder once more. The icy wind lashed across the deck as the hatch burst open. One by one, pale faces emerged from the belly of the submarine, exhausted, eyes hollow from 3 days of darkness and fear. Steam rose from their soaked uniforms as the night air struck their skin. For a brief moment, every man just breathed, gulping down the fresh oxygen like drowning souls breaking through the surface. "Deck gun, ready positions!" Carl shouted. His voice cracked, not from fear, but from sheer exhaustion. He gripped the cold metal rail, staring across the moonlit water. There, a shape cutting through the waves. A British destroyer, its searchlights sweeping across the sea like the eyes of judgment. The beam caught the U-boat, freezing it in a ghostly white glare. "Target acquired," Hans said quietly. The British captain must have been as shocked as they were. A German submarine rising from the depths, battered and burning like a beast refusing to die. "Sir," Schultz called from the conning tower, "we've only got 1 shell left for the main gun." Carl's eyes narrowed. "Then we make it count." He aimed himself, steady hands despite the shaking deck. The gun thundered, a single flash of defiance against the darkness. The shell streaked across the water and struck the destroyer's bow, throwing up a column of spray and flame. It didn't sink her, but it made her stop. "They're hesitating," Hans said. Carl smiled faintly. "Good, they should." But the destroyer recovered quickly. Within moments, its own guns rotated toward the crippled submarine. "Brace for impact." The first British shell screamed overhead, exploding harmlessly in the water. The second found its mark, tearing through the U-boat's aft section. The deck shook violently. Men were thrown against the railings, sparks flying. "Fire back!" Carl shouted. But there were no more shells. The destroyer's loudspeaker crackled to life over the waves. "U-boat, this is His Majesty's ship Vigilant. Cease resistance and surrender immediately, or you will be destroyed." Hans looked to Carl. "Sir, what do we do?" Carl stood there, breathing heavily. His eyes drifted toward the stars, cold, distant, uncaring. He thought of his crew, of the long days trapped beneath the sea,
of the men who had died without even seeing the sky again. Then he said, softly, "We surrender." The words tasted bitter, but he knew there was no honor in dying now, not after everything they had survived. He ordered the signal flag raised, white cloth torn from the medic's sheet. The British guns went silent, searchlights fixed on them as smaller boats approached. Armed sailors climbed aboard, shouting orders. The Germans were disarmed and lined up on the deck. Carl was the last to emerge fully from the conning tower. A British officer, young, stern-faced, met him halfway. "You are the captain?" Carl nodded. "Kapitänleutnant Carl Voss, U-557. The officer studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. "Lieutenant Arthur Miles, Royal Navy. You've given us quite a chase, Captain." Carl hesitated, then shook his hand. "It wasn't my plan to end it like this." The officer gestured toward the burning submarine. "No one ever plans to." As dawn broke, the once proud U-boat was sinking by the stern. Her hull groaned one final time before slipping beneath the waves. The crew watched silently. Some saluted, others simply bowed their heads. When the last trace of the submarine vanished, the sea became calm again, as if nothing had ever happened. Hours later, on board HMS Vigilant, the captured crew sat below deck, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea offered by their captors. It was strange. Hours ago, these men had been enemies. Now they sat side by side in silence, united by exhaustion more than ideology. Hans whispered to Sir, "They're treating us well." Carl nodded. "They respect sailors, even enemy ones. They know what the sea does to a man." The officer entered the room. "Captain Voss," he said, "my commander wishes to speak with you." Carl followed him to the upper deck. The sea stretched endlessly, golden under the morning light. The commander greeted him with a nod. "You fought well. It's rare to see a U-boat crew come back from that depth alive." Carl replied quietly, "Luck, and men who refuse to give up." The commander smiled faintly. "Then you've earned your survival." He paused. "You'll be taken to a POW camp in Scotland. From there, who knows? The war is turning, Captain. You might see its end." Carl looked out over the horizon. "I've already seen its end. Down there, in the dark." 2 months later, POW camp in Scotland. Snow fell gently over the camp fences. Inside, German sailors repaired nets, chopped wood, and exchanged cigarettes with their guards. Life had slowed to a quiet rhythm. Carl sat alone near the fence, carving something into a piece of driftwood. It was the shape of a U-boat, his U-557, frozen in time just as it had been before it sank. Hans approached, holding 2 cups of tea.
"You still thinking about that day?" Carl smiled faintly. Every day. 72 hours felt like a lifetime. Hans sat beside him. "You made the right call, Captain. We're alive because of you." Carl shook his head. "We're alive because the sea allowed it." He looked up at the sky. Gray, endless, but free. Maybe that's what survival means. Not victory, just being allowed another sunrise. Hans followed his gaze. "Do you ever think we'll go back?" Carl exhaled. "Not to war, but maybe to the sea." The wind carried their words away, soft and fleeting. In the distance, the camp loudspeaker played a BBC broadcast. News of Allied advances, of changing tides. The war was nearing its final chapters. Carl listened quietly. He knew history would remember great battles, powerful generals, grand strategies. But not them. Not a handful of sailors who survived in darkness, fighting not for glory, but for breath. And maybe that was enough. Because in that silent world beneath the sea, when all machines had failed, it wasn't weapons or orders that mattered. It was conscience, courage, and the unbreakable will to live. Years later, long after the war ended, a diver exploring wrecks off the Norwegian coast discovered a twisted piece of metal, a fragment of a submarine's hull. Stamped faintly on it were the letters U-557. He brought it to the surface,
cleaned it, and placed it in a small museum. There, a plaque reads, "In memory of those who endured the depths, the men of U-557, who faced the sea and lived." And in that simple line, the world remembers not just a story of survival, but of human endurance against impossible odds, the true heartbeat of every war untold. The hours had become meaningless. The men no longer counted minutes or measured time by meals. There were no meals left, only a few pieces of damp bread, a tin of sardines, and air that burned in their lungs. Every breath felt like swallowing smoke. Oberleutnant Fischer sat slumped against the bulkhead, eyes half open, muttering names of ports and people he once knew. His once crisp uniform was soaked in sweat, now gray with oil and condensation. Around him, his crew lay sprawled, some praying, others staring blankly at the trembling lights above. The diesel fumes had faded hours ago, replaced by the sour stench of human exhaustion. Each man had taken turns holding the emergency air hose to his face, drawing short breaths of what little compressed oxygen remained. But that too was nearly gone. Then, faintly, a new sound cut through the silence. A distant metallic knock. At first they thought it was another hallucination, but the sonar operator, barely conscious, pressed his ear to the steel wall. "Herr Kalun, it's from outside." Every man in the control room lifted his head. Another clang, then two more. Rhythmic, deliberate. Morse code. Someone was knocking back. Fischer's eyes widened. He stumbled to the wall, pressing his palm against it. "They found us," he breathed. He grabbed a wrench and began tapping back, a weak but desperate rhythm of life. For the first time in 70 hours, hope cut through the darkness. On the surface above, the Norwegian sea was calm. A British trawler, converted into a rescue vessel, had detected the faint sonar echoes of a sunken submarine 2 hours earlier. The Royal Navy had arrived after picking up distress signals from earlier U-boat activity in the area. But what they discovered wasn't an enemy attack. It was a German U-boat stuck at the bottom, powerless and silent. They had no way of knowing if anyone was still alive. Still, the captain ordered a deep-sea diver team to prepare. The men descended, guided by sonar and the steady pulse of their own oxygen pumps. When the diver's hand brushed against the cold hull of the submarine, he froze. Then came the first signal. 3 faint taps.
The diver's heart pounded. He tapped back. "They're alive," he shouted into his radio. Inside the U-boat, chaos turned to jubilation. Men who could barely stand began to cry and laugh. Some shouted prayers, others hugged one another. The radio man tried to send a final weak burst through the emergency transmitter, hoping the signal would reach the surface. The message was simple: alive, oxygen low, help fast. The British divers worked fast, but the rescue was perilous. Any wrong move could collapse the weakened hull or flood the entire compartment. The sub lay at nearly 200 meters, far beyond safe diving limits for the equipment of the time. Hours passed. The crew inside began to lose consciousness again. The air had thinned to a suffocating haze. Fischer forced himself to stay awake, shaking each man who drifted too deep into sleep. He knew if they slept now, they might never wake again. Then came the creak of metal above, the sound of a latch turning. Salt water sprayed through the seams. For a horrifying moment, they thought the hull was giving way. But then, the emergency hatch near the aft section opened and a gloved hand reached inside. "Stay calm, we've got you," shouted a muffled voice through the water. One by one, the survivors were pulled out. The freezing seawater bit into their skin as they rose through the narrow escape trunk. Most had to be carried, barely conscious. Fischer was the last to leave. Before he climbed the ladder, he turned one last time to the control room, his command center, his coffin, and the place where 22 of his men still lay motionless. He saluted quietly, then disappeared into the darkness above. When they broke the surface, the night sky looked like heaven itself had opened.
The air was crisp, alive. Fisher gasped as his lungs filled with it, coughing violently but smiling through the pain. The rescuers pulled him aboard. A medic wrapped him in blankets as he mumbled in broken English, "Danke, you saved us." But the truth was more complex. The British officers stared at the survivors with mixed emotions: relief that lives were saved, disbelief that the enemy they had hunted for months now lay shivering before them as helpless men. A few days later, in a naval hospital in Scotland, Fisher awoke to find an officer sitting beside his bed. "You're lucky to be alive," the man said. 72 hours at the bottom of the sea. No one thought it possible. Fisher didn't respond at first. He stared at the ceiling, hearing the echoes of the hull groaning, the cries of his men, and the sound of his own heartbeat slowing in the dark. Finally, he whispered, "It wasn't luck. It was them, my crew." The officer nodded silently. Weeks later, the Royal Navy retrieved the wreck. Inside, they found the logbook, water-stained but intact. The final entry, written in Fisher's own hand, read, "If anyone finds this, tell them we fought the sea, not the enemy. Tell them we didn't surrender. We survived." The story spread quickly. Newspapers in London and Berlin both printed it, one calling it an act of humanity beneath the waves, the other a testament to German endurance. But those who were there remembered it differently. To them, it wasn't about nations or victories. It was about men trapped in steel darkness, bound together by fear and hope. It was about the thin line between life and death, and how courage doesn't always roar. It sometimes whispers through gasping breaths in a silent submarine. Years later, when the war had ended, Fisher visited the sea again. He stood on the rocky coast of Norway, staring out towards the gray horizon. Somewhere beneath those waters lay the wreck of EU 384, his ship, his past, his ghosts. He closed his eyes and whispered a quiet farewell. And as the wind howled through the fjord, he thought he heard it again, those faint metallic taps from deep below, a message from the depths. We're still here.